I gotta say, this is awful that Diddy owes his life to Mark Agnifilo, literally his life, because he could have gotten life in prison were it not for Mark Agnifilo, his defense lawyer, who had a brilliant strategy.
The fallout hits differently when the walls finally stop holding. When the people who spent years patching the cracks decide the structure is too rotten to stand. When the last line of defense.
And Diddy screwed him over when he hired this videographer to chronicle his life without telling Mark Agnifilo that when Diddy and Mark were on the phone, this videographer was recording what Mark clearly expected to be an attorney-client privileged relationship. Now, it is true that the client holds that privilege, the lawyer doesn't, but Mark's clear expectation was that this was a private conversation. These were private conversations, and that he and Diddy could talk openly, and Mark could talk to Diddy not just as a client, but as a person, and tried to guide him in a time leading up to his arrest. And unbeknownst to Mark Agnifilo, Diddy has got this guy recording the conversation as he's sitting there saying, "You are screwing this up. You are messing up this case. We're losing." And knowing that that's on tape. And it's almost like he's performing for the camera and not telling Mark what's going on. And the really enraging part about it is that Mark Agnifilo won this case for Diddy with legal strategy. It wasn't just an accident that this jury that had heard all of this in the news before the trial voted not guilty on all the serious charges. It was Mark Agnifilo that did that. Yet Diddy secretly records this guy and embarrasses him. And yeah, you could say, well, Diddy never expected that it would end up being broadcast somewhere else. Well, okay, but Diddy was planning on using it, or he wouldn't have had it recorded in the first place. So it's just really, really unfair. And I know that in a way this sounds crazy, that I'm getting so upset about Diddy, and yet there's video of Diddy beating Cassie. Well, that's horrendous, but that doesn't mean you can't look at something else as well. And I just think, as a lawyer, I just think this is just so outrageous that he would do something like this, and not even understanding what Agnifilo's legal theory was. Because I will tell you that when we did our first documentary on Diddy, which was 8 months before the trial, Mark Agnifilo said to me on camera that he is going to tell this jury that this was a successful black man that prosecutors were trying to take down because they couldn't get into his bank accounts because they were clean, and he couldn't deal with they couldn't deal with taxes because he wasn't committing tax fraud. So they go into his bedroom. And that's what Mark Agnifilo said 8 months before. And he goes into the trial and he essentially wins that argument. Whether you believe it or not, a jury that sat through the whole thing, they believed it, and ultimately they convicted him on this BS Mann Act thing. So Diddy won that case. And one of the reasons he won the case is something that Agnifilo got criticized for. That when he did the documentary with me, he was making a joke about the baby oil. Remember, he said, "Oh, well, you know, I didn't know he bought in bulk. He must have bought 1,000.
The one group built to shield, redirect, spin, delay, and bury steps back and says, "Not anymore." And that's exactly the kind of moment unfolding right now, as the once untouchable figure at the center of a storm finds themselves suddenly, violently, and unmistakably alone. No lifelines, no protection, no one left to intercept the blows. Because nothing signals collapse like when the lawyer finally walks away. For years, this figure moved like gravity didn't apply. Everything bent around them: systems, institutions, people, narratives. Every accusation, every rumor, every whisper was either paid off, brushed aside, or snuffed out before it could spark into a blaze. They lived in a world where consequences were theoretical concepts, something that applied to everyone else. And why not? They had the power, the reach, the money, the influence, and most importantly, a legal machine built like a fortress. But fortresses don't fall from the outside. They crumble.
Witness, and a lot of the witnesses were telling the truth, but the truth didn't hurt Sean. It helped him. There were some people who were shading the truth. The great thing about it was there was a ton of evidence in written communications that people had created at the time, all these text messages. There were videos, and that really helped us expose the truth because these were things that had been recorded this is what people were, the girlfriends, others were saying to Sean at the time of the events in question. And so, there was really no way for the witnesses or the government to hide what was in the written documents.
Now, I will tell you, if you had been following what we've been doing here on Sidebar Law and Crime, we call balls and strikes. So there were, during the course of the trial, we would say this was the strength of the prosecution, this was the strength of the defense. There was such effective cross-examination of these key witnesses that we all kind of wondered, was the defense going to call any witnesses? And you really did. And what was that decision? Because I understand there were witnesses who were planning to be called. There was an idea to put forward a defense case. There was a choice not to do that. Can you talk to us a little bit more about what that strategy was about?
Sure. I mean, you always have to be ready to put on a case. At the end of the day, what it comes down to at the end of the government's case is how well do you feel it went in for us? And it's always risky to put on a defense case. People don't realize that, but there's always two sides to everything. And if you put on a witness, and even if it's, 70% good, if the prosecution scores some points, it can really undermine you. And so if you feel like the government's case has gone in really well for you, it can be actually riskier to call any witnesses. People don't necessarily realize that. But at the end of the day, we just made a decision that we thought the case had come in well, and we didn't want to, sort of change the dynamic in a way that could be risky for us.
Was Christina Quorum ever potentially going to be called by the defense? We were all shocked why the government never chose to call her, since, her name came up almost every single day through almost every witness. Was there a plan by the defense to call her?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to get into specific plans or non-plans, but it was more of an overall decision just not to put anyone on and just to use a few pieces of evidence that hadn't come in.
What do you think about the prosecution's choice not to call her? Because I will tell you, we did lunchtime shows, live shows with our audience. I would say 80% of the questions that we got during 7 weeks of testimony was, why is she not being called and will she be called? Were you surprised the prosecution chose not to call who was supposed to be the main alleged co-conspirator?
I mean, I don't think so. I think that she would have been a double-edged sword for them, and they probably didn't want to take the risk. As you saw during the trial, even a number of the witnesses that they had always planned to call that they did put in kind of blew up in their faces or had positive things to say about Sean that maybe they weren't anticipating. And so it would have been pretty risky for them to put Christina Quorum on the stand, I think.
There was so much being said about your client in that trial, obviously in the media, facing a number of different lawsuits. We also wondered whether or not he, and it's his decision alone, whether he wanted to take the stand and give his story, tell his story, give his version of events. Obviously, there are a ton of risks that come with putting a defendant on the stand, but it would be his choice. Was there a conversation about that?
Well, I mean, I can't get into, attorney-client privilege conversations. Obviously, he thought about it, decided not to. And, as I indicated earlier, we thought the case had gone in really well for us. And so we liked where we were. So that was basically the decision.
Now, the big news
from within. And the first stone always drops quietly, an uneasy pause, a delayed statement, a suspicious silence. But now the silence has turned into an open exit. The lawyer, the strategist, the fixer, the shield, gone. Not replaced, not reassigned, gone. And when the inner circle starts thinning, everybody knows it's because something has been uncovered that no one wants their name tied to, not even the person paid to defend it. What's coming out behind the scenes isn't just whispers. It's not murmurs from anonymous corners. It's not the usual pattern of accusations that can be settled, redirected, or minimized. No, this time it's different. This time the whispers come with documentation, with patterns, with details that can't be smoothed over. Everyone can feel the shift. Everyone can sense the panic. And the one person who should be the calmest, the attorney, is suddenly nowhere to be seen. That's not a coincidence. That's a warning. Because lawyers don't walk away from power lightly. They don't just drop a
news, some of the big news, a lot of big news came out after the trial, was the firing of Maureen Comey, the lead prosecutor in this case. Now, there's obviously a political angle to it. There are comments that she has made, but I have to ask, you going head to head against her for so many weeks, months and before that, the firing of her, what did you make of that?
I think it was unfortunate. She's a very well-respected prosecutor. We had good sort of professional relationships with her during the course of the trial. And, I don't really think it had anything to do with the trial, but I can't really say anything beyond that. It just,
sure.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fair enough. Let's talk about something we can get into quite a bit. Let's talk bail. Okay, so we did a previous sidebar breaking down the defense's renewed motion for release, several arguments for why Sean Combs, should be released on bail pending sentencing, acquitted of the most serious charges. There's no comparable case of someone who is convicted of the Mann Act alone and not engaging in sex trafficking or a prostitution for financial gain, and they would be locked up like this. Talked about the issues plaguing the MDC, how it is dangerous, how he's not a risk of flight, not a danger to the community. But do you think Judge Arun Subramanian is going to be persuaded by your letter, by your motion? Because obviously he specifically highlighted after the verdict your client's violence, how the defense asserted at trial that Combs was violent. Do you think he's going to have a change of opinion now based upon the legal papers?
Well, I think we certainly hope so. And, as we pointed out in the papers, the unfortunate violence that occurred was mostly a really long time ago, other than the one incident in June that Jane testified to, which was kind of unusual. They had been together for 3 years. There had been no violence, and she essentially started the fight. I'm not excusing anything, but it was kind of a one-off. And I think the government really hadn't put in any evidence of any recent violence. The Intercontinental video, remember, that was almost 10 years ago. He broke up with Cassie in 2018. And in our reply papers yesterday, we submitted a letter from Gina Hyun, who was one of the alleged victims, a different ex-girlfriend. And I think it was a pretty powerful letter about how Sean has changed, how she's not concerned about violence. She thinks he should be released on bail. So we're hoping that that will persuade the judge, given everything else, particularly, as you noted, like the really, really unusual nature of this particular Mann Act conviction and the fact that he's already been in prison, or jail rather, for like 11 months. This case is a one-off to begin with, but we're not aware of any case like this with a Mann Act conviction where anyone's done that much time to begin with. So.
And prosecutors, I'm imagining, have come back or will come back and say, well, listen, look, after the raids on his property, he engaged, or what they will say, he allegedly engaged in criminal activity and, obviously violence, they say, with Jane. But they say, look, what was in his hotel room when he was picked up in New York. They made allegations of what he was trying to do while he was in the MDC, whether it was using other inmates' phone privileges to have three-way phone calls. That was litigated before trial. What would be your response to say, you make the point that he is a changed person. The violence that was shown during the course of this trial is from years ago, but how would you convince the judge to say, listen, we are being truthful, we are being honest, we are being forefront, that he really is a different human being? Because the
high-profile client, unless the fallout is so toxic that even standing next to it becomes career suicide. Think about how deep the rot has to be for the person whose job is literally to handle damage to say, no, this is too much. So now the foundation cracks widen. All the years of maneuvering, controlling, threatening, and bargaining start losing their effect. The people who were once silent are now stepping forward. The ones who were too afraid now see the armor has fallen off. The ones who were ignored now realize the empire isn't fireproof anymore. And when the lawyer walks away, it sends one message louder than anything else. Whatever's coming cannot be protected against. The fear behind closed doors is real. You can feel it. You can see it in the scramble, the rushed statements, the sudden public appearances that feel more like desperation than confidence. You can hear it in the carefully crafted denials that don't sound as sharp as they used to, the cracks in the voice, the pauses, the uncertainty. It's all there. The aura of control is gone. And the public senses it too.
Judge, again, this was right after the verdict and didn't have an opportunity for a briefing schedule. How can you make the argument that he is different and that he should be trusted?
Well, I mean, I think, the point you mentioned about the arrest, I mean, unfortunately, Sean has struggled with drug addiction for a long time. And I think one of the good things and positive things is that has come out of his incarceration. It's given him an opportunity, to rehabilitate. He's committed to continuing that. He's committed to a long-term program of therapy and helping with the domestic violence problem that he's had in the past. So, at a certain point, you have to just, maybe it is a leap of faith, but you have to just give a person another chance. And he really is committed to change and to there being a new chapter of service on his part. So, I think we have to hope that the judge will agree with that. And I think we've made a strong case for that.
Do you know when the judge might make a decision on bail?
We don't know.
Okay. If he denies release again, does that give you a sense of what sentencing could be like? Now, to be clear, my understanding is Judge Arun Subramanian even said at the point, if I make a decision on release, it's not indicative of where I'm leaning towards sentencing. I know there's a pre-sentencing investigation still being conducted or has been conducted. There's a lot of factors to consider. But I have to ask about whether this is going to, have an effect on sentencing. Do you believe it's going to have an effect on sentencing? Does it give you a preview of where the judge is lining up? Because my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, you are probably going to be arguing for time served, maybe a minimum of 21 to 27 months. Where do you think the judge is going to go here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to take each step at a time and that the judge is not going to prejudge that. There's a lot more information he needs to get, not only the pre-sentence report, but we're going to make a very fulsome sentencing submission. And he's going to have, a much more detailed picture. Even, the trial was about the charges, right? And he doesn't have the full picture of all the factors about Sean's life that he's going to consider. There's going to be a big fight about the sentencing guidelines. We think actually we're going to end up arguing for an even lower guideline range than we had originally believed at the time of the verdict, where we didn't have we had like a couple of hours to try to figure out what to say about bail. So, I hope the judge will grant bail, but I feel confident that even if he doesn't, it doesn't necessarily mean he's not going to sentence Sean to time served. He's going to take everything into account when he gets all the submissions. And, I've got a lot of confidence that the judge is going to be fair and not prejudge the situation.
And you also have this motion for judgment of acquittal, that the Mann Act convictions should be tossed out, Combs be granted at a minimum a new trial. Number of very interesting arguments that are present, and it's basically that there has really never been, as we've talked about, a prosecution conviction on a Mann Act like this, that Combs wasn't profiting off of the business. There were all consenting adults that were involved. The jury didn't find that there was any sex trafficking, that this isn't even prostitution per se, it's more voyeurism, that the intent wasn't for people to travel for sex for money, but paid them for their time. They were all having a good time. There's a First Amendment argument that the freak-offs and the hotel nights were performances that were videotaped so he could watch them later. It's amateur pornography. There's an argument that he was prejudiced because of all the other evidence that came in to prove RICO or sex trafficking, but would never have come in if this was merely a prosecution for the Mann Act violation.
People have watched the pattern for years. Accusations arise, denials drop, distractions spread, and the cycle repeats. But this time, the cycle is broken. The lawyer's exit snaps the system in half. There's no longer someone in the background pulling strings, intercepting calls, intimidating witnesses, or negotiating silence. It's all falling directly onto the figure who once stood untouchable. Now they stand isolated, exposed, cornered. And nothing terrifies a powerful person more than realizing power doesn't protect them anymore. Behind the scenes, the pressure is mounting. Every person who once felt outnumbered now senses an opening. Investigators who once hesitated now push harder. People who once backed down now step up. There's momentum building, a shift in the air, a recognition that the illusion of invincibility has shattered, because when the attorney, the final shield, steps away, it signals that something enormous, something unmanageable, something irreversible is happening. You don't abandon a sinking ship when it hits a wave, you abandon it when you know the hole below deck can't be patched. And that's what this is. This is the
Relations. Specifically, we talk about the Intercontinental Hotel footage. But couldn't the counter argument be, if you look at the text messages and voice notes and the travel hotel, the payment documentation, that these charges, the Mann Act charges, could have been proven based on that evidence alone and not anything else about racketeering or sex trafficking?
Well, I think that goes, I don't agree with that. I think that, as we argued in the papers, the government didn't really show that the purpose of the travel was to have sex for money, and that in fact all the testimony and a lot of the other evidence showed that the men were being paid for their time. But even if we were wrong about that one, we have a number of the other arguments that you mentioned that really aren't undermined by those records. So for instance, one of our main arguments is that this statute, which used to be called the White Slave Traffic Act, it has this long history, but even with this long history, it's never been applied to a case like this. The term prostitution in a lot of states doesn't include this conduct, even if someone's being paid. If the person making the payment is paying essentially to observe other people having sex, that's not prostitution. So we've got the First Amendment argument, as you mentioned, and the new trial argument. So all of those arguments, I think, are independent of, the issue you raised, which, so we think we have a really strong motion. And so we're hoping the judge will agree. We'll see.
So just to be clear, I'll list out a couple of things that stood out to me when we were watching the trial. There was apparently this voice message that was played from Combs to Paul, right, one of the purported sex workers. Hit me up when you close. There was a voice message. Hey Jess, I need to get him from Atlanta to here. Let me know. Hit me up. There was a message from, I think, Combs to Christina Coram. Can security bring me 5,000? There was another audio message to Jane. I sent you 15K, baby girl. There was another one to Frank Rodriguez. Frank, make sure that room is set up right. So in other words, you could look at this and say, and the argument is, even despite all that, it's paying people for their time. It's setting up, let's say, amateur pornography. What makes this not, because it always seemed that those charges were relatively straightforward, transporting people for the purposes of sex work. You're saying the intent was not sex work. That just so happened, whatever happened, happened, but the intent wasn't there. Just want to clarify that point.
Yeah, so that's one of the arguments. And then the other argument is just that it's more of a pure legal argument that prostitution only includes when you're paying someone to have sex with you, and he wasn't having sex with the males. So that's kind of a totally separate thing, even if you buy the government's argument that these payments were always for sex. And I do want to point out that there's testimony and evidence that there were a number of occasions where the guys didn't end up having sex and they still got paid for their time. There's a bunch of text messages between Sean and people who work for Cowboys for Angels, one of the escort services, where, she's making clear that they dot all their I's and cross all their T's and that this isn't sex for money. So that's kind of his mindset. And, the crime is transportation with the intent for the person being transported to engage in prostitution. So it's all sort of what's in his head and whether he's believing that he's paying, or arranging the transportation rather, in connection with prostitution. And then you get into sort of what is prostitution, and does it include, paying someone even if you're not the person who's going to have sex with them.
Let's say the motion for
the moment the people closest to the situation realize the sinking has already begun. The legal guardrail that once held everything in place is gone, and without it, every accusation gains strength, every witness gains confidence, every document gains weight, every story gains traction, and the public watches the once protected individual struggle to hold everything together with shaking hands. The desperation becomes visible. Suddenly there are emergency meetings behind locked doors, longtime associates distancing themselves, statements crafted so carefully that you can practically hear the fear between the lines. People who once boasted about their connection now pretend they barely knew anything. It's a chain reaction of self-preservation, And it all spirals from the fact that the one person built to defend won't defend anymore. That's the sign. That's the collapse. Because lawyers are often the last to abandon ship. They stay through scandals, through allegations, through brutal public scrutiny. They defend clients accused of anything and everything. But there's a limit, a line they won't cross. And when that line is crossed, it's not about morals, it's about survival. If the evidence is too damaging, if the behavior too disturbing, if the fallout too massive, the attorney will choose their name over their clients.
Separated from his family, has mounting legal bills from the indictment and defending lawsuits that were the direct result of the United States Attorney Damian Williams' prejudicial press conference announcing this case, and has lived in MDC for over a year, despite having every intention on fighting this case from day one. His defense attorneys cite other instances where his life has been systematically dismantled. For example, after Cassie's lawsuit and the lawsuits after, his companies were unable to operate as they once were, and he had to let go of over 1,000 employees. Some employees, according to the document, were unable to get new employment because of their past association with the mogul. His federal case has also had devastating consequences for his children. They were canceled and lost business opportunities. The family's Hulu show was canceled after Cassie's lawsuit. He was removed from the boards of 3 charter schools he created. He was stripped of his honorary doctorate degree from Howard University. He was forced to return the key to the city of New York. And he had to step down from his TV network, Revolt, which according to the filing was one of 2 black TV networks in the United States. So in all, the defense is hoping the judge sentences him to a 14-month sentence, meaning if the judge sides with him, it's likely he could be out of jail before the holidays. As of this recording, though, prosecutors haven't submitted their recommendations for his sentencing. But they've previously said that he has an extreme history of violence and that the attempts to minimize his conduct show he's still very dangerous. So that was a lot, right? A lot of legalese, a lot of pages to go through. So let's break it down further with none other than criminal defense attorney Safa Robinson-Ferrer. Safa, always great to see you, and thanks so much for joining me. Let's take a little step back. It's almost sentencing time for Diddy. He needs support. The defense sent a bunch of letters, some including from Young Miami, Dallas Austin, Stevie J, the mothers of his daughters Love and Chance, his mom, his sister, all of his kids minus the youngest one. But what did you make of the letters of support?
I'm not surprised to see letters of support here. That's actually pretty typical as sentencing is about to commence, or shortly, at least a week or two before the sentencing commences. And a lot of times defendants and clients will submit letters that are on behalf of family members and loved ones, giving a clearer picture to the judge as to who this person is generally, or who this person is and what they mean to their family and their loved ones. And that's a part of what we call a mitigation or sentencing memorandum that goes to the court in order to get a lesser sentence, or to give the judge an idea of, this is a good guy, you know, mistakes happen or bad things happen, but he's been reformed, rehabilitated, and we as his family need him back.
And are you surprised more famous faces didn't come front and center to possibly also voice their support in favor of Diddy? I was surprised to only kind of see really the 3 standout names being Dallas Austin, Young Miami, and Stevie J, at least to me. But are you surprised other famous faces didn't also voice their support through letters, like maybe Ye, who attended the court that one day?
I'm actually not too surprised that we haven't heard more from some of the other celebrities, because I think that anybody with a pretty sound PR team is going to tell them to stay far away from this and to not give any opinions of it. I am kind of surprised that we haven't heard anything from Ye, but you know, that's his prerogative. Of course, he has shown his support throughout the trial, and anybody who is willing and wants to support Mr. Combs through the sentencing phase and provide a memorandum or a letter, then they're able to do that. But I think considering what the defense has provided to the court, there have been significant amounts of letters and things of that nature that the judge can go off of to get another side of Mr. Combs, maybe different from what the judge has heard at trial.
Do you think any of the letters kind of swayed maybe even your opinion in terms of what we heard at trial versus kind of the aftermath, even, you know, before the trial began, that made you change your opinion in any type of way? I kind of felt like everything just felt kind of repetitive a little bit.
I think the most captivating letter that I got a chance to view was his mother's, and she makes a very good point. She's an 85-year-old woman.
That choice signals that the narrative everyone thought was controlled is now slipping. So now the figure at the center of the storm fights alone, and it shows. The arrogance is fading, the confidence replaced with a tightness around the eyes. The usually polished statements sound brittle. The body language stiffens, the eyes dart, the voice cracks. The carefully constructed persona starts to unravel, because without a legal strategist guiding every move, every misstep becomes a weapon against them. And the world is watching. People are no longer asking whether something happened, they're asking how deep the darkness goes. The conversation shifts from speculation to examination. Documents start circulating, patterns become clear, stories line up, trajectories intersect, and suddenly, the narrative that was once dismissed as rumor now stands in the harshest possible light. The lawyer's departure amplifies everything. It validates every concern. It fuels every suspicion. It weakens every denial. Because people know how this works. Lawyers don't run unless there's something worth running from. And behind the scenes, the panic intensifies, calls go unanswered, doors close, former allies quietly pack their distance, advisors start whispering about contingency plans. The inner circle fractures as everyone tries to figure out how to protect themselves, and the person at the center tries desperately to maintain control, to project strength, to act like nothing is happening. But the mask is thinning. The cracks are too visible. The pressure is too heavy. When the lawyer leaves, it marks the beginning of the fall, not the end, because the legal system doesn't slow down out of sympathy. Investigators don't pause because the defense is in shambles. The world doesn't wait, and the avalanche that once seemed improbable now gains unstoppable force. This is the moment where someone who built a life on dominance suddenly learns what it feels like to be dominated by consequences. But the world had changed. The walls were closing in. The silence of the legal team was louder than any accusation. And every shadow they once hid behind had dissolved. This is the moment where the walls don't just shake, they collapse. This is the moment where the fortress becomes a ruin. And as the dust rises, there's one undeniable truth echoing across everything. When your own lawyer won't stand next to you, the world won't either.